This is Where Did the Road Go? Our aim is to explore the fringe, to be true skeptics and question openly, to investigate the paranormal, bring light to the dark corners of history, and give a voice to the shunned of science. We deal in mystery and the important questions that these subjects bring to light. What is reality? Who are we? And why are we here? Join us on the web at wheredidtheroadgo.com for a full show archive, links to all our social media, upcoming schedule, and much, much more. Now, join your host Soraya on this week's edition of Where Did the Road Go?
So tonight on Where Did the Road Go, we're going to be talking with Steph Young about her new book, Taken in the Woods. And I really enjoyed this one. I really enjoyed reading it. It's an easy read. It's a very inexpensive book as well, the ebook on Amazon. So, if you're interested in this stuff, I highly recommend you pick up her book. She has a few of them there. And this is the second one we've had her on about. And if you are going to buy it, I ask you click on the link on Where Did the Road Go, because it helps us. All right, and without any further ado, please enjoy this interview with Steph Young. All right, welcome back to the show, Steph.
Hi.
And one of the things I wanted to get into first is how you got into writing these books. And a lot of people have questioned your use of a pen name on them.
Right, okay. Well, I started off, initially I was writing magazine articles, which is quite a common thing to use pen names. And I started writing a book on time travel, and I used a pen name, which was Stephen. And then it sort of became too difficult to sort of change it. And I actually didn't imagine that the books would be that popular. So when I got moving on to the Something in the Woods and now the new one, I kind of stuck with the Stephen. But obviously now when I go on radio shows, I have to explain it. But, it's a pseudonym. It's quite a common thing to do. But I do like that bit of anonymity as well. So, that's kind of the reason I did it. And I'm stuck with it, really.
Yeah, I imagine that would be kind of difficult to change at this point.
Yeah, I know it causes confusion, and in fiction it's a very common thing to use a pen name, but not so much maybe in this kind of field. But I like having that sort of veil of security as well, because some of the subjects that I talk about are quite controversial as well.
Yeah, I'm sure you get plenty of weird emails about it.
I get a lot of them, yeah. Some are really, really fascinating, but a lot of strange things, yeah.
So what is the title of this new book? Because it's pretty long on Amazon.
Yeah, well, it's Taken in the Woods to fit in with the other ones, because it's kind of a continuation of the ones before, but it's also the Body Collectors, a Chronicle of Stolen Souls, because it's looking into disappearances again. If I just kind of recap, so I started writing one on time travel, and in that one I was coming across people disappearing into dimensions or vortexes or parallel worlds, and it led me into the Something in the Woods book, which is more looking for the reasons why people disappear, not necessarily just into dimensions, because I was coming across forests and woods and mountain areas where there appeared to be people disappearing into parallel worlds, but also there was, for example, in Makawasi Stone Forest in Peru, there's a reputation there of people going missing, but there's also supposed to be a confluence of ley lines, which are Celtic abductions or fairy ley lines. And in another place, Ballybolly in Northern Ireland, it's supposed to be called a druid doorway to another world, because there's ancient texts that talk about people disappearing and not returning from the forest. So I started off from the time travel, moved into the woods, and now this one, Taken in the Woods, is a follow-up one. That's the latest one. And it's a continuation of a theme, really, because it's looking at why people are going missing in places that are rural, woodlands, mountains, forests, and it's trying to find sort of the explanations. So it could be that they're disappearing in vortexes, dimensions. It could be that there's a paranormal explanation. It could be something to do with the ley lines. It could be something to do with the granite. And I'm looking at all the different factors. So that's kind of to introduce how this came about.
Okay, all right. So you just have the 3 out then?
Actually, I think it's 4.
4.
One is called Predators in the Woods. That's looking at all the different cryptids accounts. So lots of sightings of strange creatures. There's people have seen goat-like entities. They've also seen entities with strange legs come up quite a lot. So they're like animals, but they look like a human form, and their legs are all twisted. And actually, I know just before the show we were talking about Pan, which is the god of the woodlands, and so perhaps it's a manifestation of that. But that book is more about all the different types of cryptid or paranormal things you can encounter.
Okay. Isn't there mysterious things in the woods too?
There is mysterious things in the woods. That was the first one. That looks as well at things like Thunderbird, Dogman, demons. It covers all different accounts like that. I guess as I've progressed through the books, I've found more and more places where strange things happen. So mysterious things in the woods, it covered places like Clapham Woods, which is in Sussex in England, and 4 bodies were found there over a period of 2 or 3 years. But there was also rumours of an occult group that was supposed to be very connected to people in high places, and lots of sort of satanic things going on there. But then there were also UFO sightings. There's also ley lines there which crisscross. So every time you sort of find out something going on at one of these places, it tends to be that there's 3 or 4 or 5 factors that kind of coexist, and you're almost trying to work out, well, which one is causing something to happen to people. There's a place called Busegi in the Carpathian Mountains in Romania, and people go into the forest area, and they come back out maybe after a couple of days having been lost, and their descriptions are that they feel like they've been thrown from one place to another. There's mists, and that they get disoriented, and then they reappear, but they have no memory of what's gone on, and yet they don't feel hungry or tired or thirsty. So there's a lot of enigmas that seem to happen in some of these places, and I really sort of carry on looking at new places now and looking at what's going on with those.
All right, and for this new book, you want to talk a little bit about the first chapter?
First chapter being the account I had, or we're looking at the dimensions?
No, the account you had, the guy who had written you.
Oh, so, yeah, I was on a program called Coast to Coast, and afterwards a man wrote to me, and he lives in the San Juan Islands. Now, a lot of it I can't go into because he wants to keep his anonymity, but he had walked around a fairy ring outside his yard and had suddenly become disoriented, confused. He felt like he was in a fog, and he described it as when you're sailing and you can't hear sounds properly when the mist has come down. So he was really disoriented, and he went and lay down, and then the next day he went to see an office because he wanted to rent a new place for his work, his self-employed, and he was really surprised because when he got there he seemed to see some kind of shiny new government complex, which he had no idea was being built. And he spoke to one of the men who was working there, and he said, you must go away, you can't be here. So he left, and then he was walking along the seafront at the Friday Harbour, and he saw that a place was closed. It's called the Sea Shepherd, their conservationist fleet, and it was all closed up. And he thought, well, that's odd. I didn't think they were closed. They'd gone. And then he walked past again a few days later, and then it was there. So he wrote to me, and he said, I heard you on the show, and I thought, that's funny because that's kind of describing some of the things you've talked about. It's kind of describing what I went through, and I couldn't understand it. It's a very, very long account, but a lot of strange things seem to be happening to him, but also on the island there. There seemed to be a growing militarization, as he described it, and possibly a base was being built underground, but possibly. He was also seeing some strange entities that seemed to be coming through, and he described there being a vortex there because it's one of the oldest mountain ranges in the world. And he said that it was, in his opinion, he felt that it was something to do with this vortex area that was allowing these sort of things to come through. And he saw a really, really thin, white kind of creature come through. And so he'd written about all of these different things that were happening to him. And I thought, well, that's funny because all of the things I'd almost finished this last book, and I thought, well, that's really funny because it covers virtually every kind of topic, because he'd described the island there, and it has a kind of sinister side in a way from the way that he described it, because it seems to be a place that ex-Black Ops people go to sort of regenerate. And he talked about super soldiers being there, and he talked about space fleets, and he talked about coming wars, and it's a very, very long account, but it encompasses so much that could potentially be going on, and it seemed that it kind of overlapped with things going on in other places, you know, whether that's in America or worldwide.
Yeah, it was a very interesting read. It was a little hard to believe a lot of it. I mean, because it's such a fantastic claim that's being made in all aspects of it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a claim that the reason he's saying that there's a claim that he could see the government building there because there was some kind of interdimensional time well that was artificially put in place. You know, and he'd spoken to intel people, and they told him this. Well, yeah, I completely agree. It's very hard to believe, but it's a possibility, and it's one of those things.
Sure.
It makes for fascinating reading. As to whether it's all actually happening, it's very, very hard to say, because until you're there and you see it, you don't know.
And if nothing else, it's definitely an interesting story.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
Like just the very idea of something like that existing. And I mean, we don't know what they have technology-wise in the military. They're probably decades and decades ahead of us at this point.
Well, yeah, I've done a lot of research on that. I sort of put some of it into the book, so I don't go too heavily into it, because I know it's hard to kind of grasp. But if you look at all the research that other people have done about it, and all of the patents that have been passed for technology, you would actually find it a lot more compelling and a lot more believable if you sort of looked a lot further into it. So there's a lot out there, but whether any of this has any bearing on what's going on in woods and forests is another matter.
Yeah, yeah. So when you get to chapter 2 in this, this was some stuff I really found fascinating. You're talking about miners who ended up in another world.
Yeah, I was looking for more accounts, really, to sort of back up the dimensions to add into the book again. And I found an account from Alan J. Hynek. Obviously, he's very well known, and he has had a letter sent to him from a miner who was in the remote part of northern Canada in the 60s. And he was waiting for his companion to come back. They were mining in separate areas. And he just took a little walk, and he saw a cliff, small cliff edge, and he saw a gouge that had sort of looked like it had been made in the side of the cliff. So he was really curious, and he went down, sort of scaled down to it, and he saw these stones there that he'd never really seen before, and he found them curious because obviously he's there mining, so that took his attention. And he thought, well, I'm going to just try and get through this little hole. And he went through it, and according to his account, there was a really strong mist, but as it started to clear, the grass appeared to get bigger and bigger, and he found himself in an oasis. But the effect it had on his mind was that he knew that he shouldn't be there, and he could barely kind of manage to get back out of there, because his mind was telling him, I'm in the wrong place, this is not where I'm supposed to be. So he was crawling back out on his hands and knees and managed to get back out, and you know, he was adamant that he had stepped into this strange dimension because the sky was different, there was no sounds, the grass shouldn't have been that tall, why would there be an oasis there? You know, it didn't make any sense because it was in the side of a cliff. So it was quite fascinating. But in that chapter as well, I think I move on to talking about the Isle of Wight, mainly because it's an area that I know very well. It's an island. It's about 17 miles by 25, and it's off the south coast of England. So it's a tiny island, and I spent a lot of time there, and it's very, very rich in terms of folklore and ghost stories. I mean, there's thousands of ghost stories that have happened there, but mostly they're kind of in the bracket of time slips. There's so many accounts of people, you know, maybe they're night fishing and they hear the footsteps on the stones in the dark, but there's nobody there when they shine a torch. And they have sightings of seeing smugglers who would be there in the old days, you know, smuggling whiskey or whatever up on the cliffs. And they have lots of sightings of hangmen as well. They used to hang people off gallows on hills there in the 1700s. And there's so many accounts of people seeing a procession, and they see this man being hung as a pirate or a smuggler. So I put a few accounts in there. I mean, there's a very, very good journalist who works there called Gay Baldwin, and she's written some books, Ghost Island and a series of books, and she has got an amazing collection of accounts. But there's several where, for example, there was a couple and they were on holiday there, and they were taking a walk down a country lane to get towards the park, and they saw a group of children playing in this big garden. And the children were dressed in really old-fashioned clothes, and they were playing with a football. They were all in a circle, but the boy, one of the boys, was kicking the football, but it wasn't going anywhere. So he was just repeatedly kicking it, but the ball wasn't moving. And they walked on, but 2 hours later they walked back down the same lane to go home, and they saw the children in exactly the same spot. The boy was still kicking the football, it still wasn't going anywhere. And as they talked about it, it suddenly vanished. They all just suddenly vanished. And there's another really good story where there's a church there called Dover Church, and it was built in the 14th century, and there was a monk who was excommunicated because he was practicing devil worship with a coven of witches. And it's quite rich in stories of witches on the island as well. And in the 1700s, the steeple needed repairing, so some labourers came over from the mainland, and they went up to repair it, and they saw this tiny, really, really shriveled man, and he was really angry with them, and he cursed them, and he said, if you don't need my church, you will suffer the same fate as the others did who came here before. So they carried on working, and they just thought it was a joke, and then they went to get the boat back to the mainland, and they disappeared, so they were never seen again. But the reason I also included the Isle of Wight is because mainly for the reason that it's supposed to be the most haunted island in the world, but the reason they say that's the case is because it's intersected with thousands of ley lines. Now, ley lines are kind of a pseudoscience because you have to be able to dowse them to find them. So I couldn't go out and find a ley line and say, there it is. But people claim to be able to find them, dowsers in particular. And they're kind of the Earth's magnetic current under the ground. Well, David Icke lives on the Isle of Wight, doesn't he? So in his opinion, all of these thousands of ley lines, not only do they cause the apparitions of ghosts, but he believes, as do several other people, that there's an occultist agenda, that they manipulate the energy on these ley lines. Because we see everything as physical, but the Luciferian agenda of the elite, as such, see it as the world is energy, fluctuating energy. So in their minds, if they can manipulate this energy, they can make it blackened and they can make it negative by repeated ritual, then they cause the energy grid to be suppressed and to be full of negative emotions. And that's the idea behind people like David Icke and David Cowan, who is probably one of the best experts. He's published by Hatcher Childress. And he said that for thousands of years, secret societies, those people who know the ancient secrets of the Earth's natural energy systems, they were able to control humanity by manipulating it for their own sinister purposes. Well, you know, you could say that's a little bit extreme, but it goes even further, because there's a guy called Ellis C. Taylor who I discovered that he does a lot of work in terms of ley lines, occult dates, and also numerology. And he claims that he's been able to find patterns of disappearances. So I came across him when I was looking into people disappearing, and there was a boy called Daniel Nolan, and he disappeared not on the Isle of Wight but on the mainland opposite. And he had actually spoken about this boy, and he'd put it in terms that the boy had been abducted and sacrificed, you know, to energize the ley lines, but the idea being that not only do you use that negative energy by sacrificing someone, but also they feed off the fear and the anxiety of somebody missing. And he claimed that there was a ley line that ran from the Isle of Wight through the path of where the boy disappeared, travelled onto the Severn Bridge, which is a notorious suicide spot, and then goes on to places of satanic power, so be that temples or somewhere that, you know, these elite allegedly gather to harness the energy. Well, the story itself about the boy disappearing was kind of what struck me, because he was night fishing in 2002 with his friends, and he was a sea scout and a canoeist, so he was always in the water. And he had been fishing. They finished about 11:30 at night, and then they went and hung out by the shops nearby, and then they called it a night, and they were all going to go home. So the boy himself went back to pick up his fishing gear, but by about 2 a.m. he hadn't got home, so his mum phoned and couldn't get an answer, so she phoned the police immediately. And the police got there, they searched, they brought police divers in, they brought army sonar equipment in, and they brought sniffer dogs, but they couldn't pick up a trace, and they couldn't find him in there. Now the thing about that was where he was by the harbour, and it was an enclosed waterway, so there wasn't a free flow to the sea. But about 8 months later, his foot was found in 40 miles away in a place called Chapman's Bay, which is in Dorset, which is a county on the mainland in England. So he'd somehow managed to travel 40 miles, but it was an enclosed waterway. So the thing was there, you could only get down to that bay if you knew the area well, because you'd have to kind of scale down the cliff to get to it. But of course you could get to it from the sea, so a boat could have come in. So going back to the ley lines and the secret society, the idea was that this person had been sacrificed because, it fitted the occult dates, numerology, ley lines. Or, it's a bit extreme to kind of think like that, so it's a possibility. But I like to just put these kind of theories out there, and, you can take them as far as you want to. With regards to the ley lines, again, I'm not sure if I mentioned it on the last show, but there was a guy called Mark Gibbons doing lots of research on it. And in my other book, Something in the Woods, there was a disappearance of a man in a place called Todmorden, which is a rural county in northern England. And he had been found on the top of a coal pile in a coal mine. Well, he'd disappeared about 2 days prior to that, but he was found, and his coat, he had his clothes on, but his coat was buttoned up wrong, his shirt was missing, and there were no footsteps in the coal. So when the police came, they found some strange green ointment on his shoulders and the burn marks, but the forensic people could never identify what the burn marks were. This was back in the 80s. And the policeman, Alan Godfrey, who'd gone there and found him, about a week later, he'd actually been out on a night patrol, and he was looking for some missing cows because they'd disappeared from a field. And he saw this bright light, two bright lights coming towards him in the road, and he thought, is that a bus or a truck? And he felt this fear, this sudden fear, and he wanted to radio to his headquarters, but he couldn't get the radio to work. So he sat in his car, because the car wouldn't go, and he just had to sit there. But he later found that he'd missed about half an hour of time, and when he looked at his shoes, he found that the soles had been torn, as if they'd been ripped open, as if he'd been dragged along the road. Well, and then he went to have some hypnotherapy to try and get regress to find out what had happened to him, because he was so confused by the incident. Because also the cows were found that night, and they were in another field that was locked, but there was no hoof marks, and it was a muddy field, so they couldn't work out how the cows had got in the field because there was no hoof marks and it was locked.
Huh.
So he thought, what the heck happened to me that night? So he had the regression, and in his mind, he said what happened was he found himself in this strange grey room, and there was a black figure, a hooded figure in a black cloak with a long grey beard, and there were these robotic little creatures and a huge black dog, and so he had no idea what was going on. So that's kind of what I cover in terms of the ley lines and things in that chapter.
We should also talk about the difference. When you use terms like Satanist and occultist, they're terms that get thrown around a lot, but their meaning tends to vary depending on what we're talking about. Because occult really just means secret.
I suppose we're talking about Luciferian, we're talking about secret societies, whether it's the Illuminati. It's a kind of, it's the idea of this elite society that use occult ritual.
Right.
As opposed,
and even when you use,
yeah.
And when you use the term satanic too, there's sort of the Christian view of satanic, which is evil, or you have the Anton LaVey view of satanic, which is just like opposition to the main society, or depending on how you want to look at it.
Yeah, I suppose I kind of think of like Satanists as a small group of, a little group of people doing it. So I kind of don't mean a little group. I kind of mean the higher level elite secret societies using some kind of ritualistic occult. So not for the good, but using it for the bad. I guess that's what I'm kind of trying to get to.
For their good, our bad.
Yes. Yeah.
One of the groups you talk about in the book is called the Finders. What do you know about them?
There's loads and loads and loads. If people want to look on the internet, it goes quite deep. But it was some kind of idea about, tied into a Franklin cover-up. So there was an idea that children were being kidnapped in America years ago, and that they were being kidnapped to be used either in rituals or used in a paedophile kind of group. And it was supposed to be going as high as politicians, but it was supposed to have been backed up as a CIA front. So it's a really long story, but there is a lot of it on the internet. But it's kind of similar to what people are saying now about in terms of using these ley lines, using these sacrifices, abductions of children. 50 to 80,000 children go missing each year, don't they, in America? So people say that there was a cover-up in terms of what was going on and who was doing it. There was a secret group abducting people, and I think the main kind of story out of that was the Johnny Gosch abduction. He was a schoolboy on his paper round, and he was abducted during the paper round, and his mother always was adamant, saying that he was abducted by an organised group because they were getting strange phone calls, and somebody saw a van taking him away, and she maintains, to this day, that it was a nationwide kind of high-level group that were doing it. So that's kind of the background to that one.
Okay, because one of the things the reason that stood out to me is I had just recently read Solving the Communion Enigma from Whitley Strieber, and he talks about them and possibly having interactions with them when he was a child. He has a bunch of memories that he can't really put in any kind of place, one by a military base, another being possibly in a cage in a laboratory, and the Finders come into this whole mess.
Oh, really?
So I had never heard of them before, and then you write about them in this just, months later after I read Strieber's book.
Oh, well, I hadn't either. I just came across it by accident, really. But there's a lot of documents to read through on the internet. And it's one of those things, people say, well, it was all just a hoax. But on the other hand, there was a retired detective from NYPD, and he did a lot of work looking into it and sort of going on shows, trying to say this is really happening, and I think I mentioned there's a writer in Veterans Today, Preston James, and he was saying, these people are kidnapped for human sacrifice, and it has still been covered up. And I don't know, it's a hell of a lot to sort of research and look into and read, so it's kind of like the reader has to decide what they think. I found something else in terms of ley lines, which just sounds way over the top, but there was a guy that says he's a 9/11 truther, and he was saying that he'd traced a ley line from that goes straight through Sandy Hook. So he was saying this was a massive ritual, and actually that's what Preston James was saying. He was saying these children were kidnapped for a sacrifice. Well, it sounds absolutely crazy. You can't prove that ley line went through Sandy Hook. You just can't prove it. But then some people say, well, yeah, it did actually. And it ties in with the way people really go into numerology when they study these things. There's a YouTube channel called Mr. Cat Eye, and if you watch his YouTubes, he goes into so much detail about all the numerology. Well, for me, I find it very hard to follow because I'm not great with maths. But if you are, it's fantastic. And some of these theories, you can either say that's a conspiracy theory and it's rubbish, or you can say, oh my gosh, there's so much, and you can really go down that field. I try not to go too far down it because I don't want to say that I believe it or not. But it opens up possibilities for people to look.
Well, I think so many conspiracy theories, whether they have any truth to them or not, are just like going down a rabbit hole.
Absolutely, yeah.
And 9/11 is possibly one of the worst, because the more you research it, the more you just sit there and go, I don't know what happened.
I know.
And when you're talking about ley lines, too, I know there have been connections between, like, UFO sightings and ley lines, as well as Paul Devereaux showed that a lot of UFO sightings also happen along fault lines, which also are connected to ley lines.
Yeah, I read some research from Mark Gibbons, actually, and he was saying 95% of abductions happen along these ley lines, particularly the ones that have been blackened. So it seems that they either attract them or that's where things manifest. You know, and you go back to David Cowan and he says that this is how people control humanity. It's a massive claim to make, but again, if you look into it, it's quite compelling in some ways. I mean, in terms of you know, these elite societies and things, I was looking at a case called the mountain that swallowed the little boy, and it's a case of a boy called Victor Shoemaker, and he disappeared in 1994 in Hampshire County in West Virginia. He was just playing with his cousins, and he went. He got really upset, and he wanted to go back home to his grandparents. He'd spent all his kind of growing up in the woods. He used to play barefoot and climb the trees, so he knew the little area quite well. But he disappeared, and the cousins and all the family were given lie detector tests and their criminal records checked. So there didn't seem to be anything in terms of what the family might have done. But they had cadaver dogs, helicopters, divers, 500 soldiers, 500 volunteers, special forces, reserves, everybody going in there trying to find him, and nobody could find him. And as I was reading about that case, I found one tiny mention in one of the newspaper articles that said the date that he disappeared might have something to do with it. And they also mentioned that there was a little triangle that was found in the area that he disappeared, and the triangle was made out of wood and rocks. So it was made to form a triangle by putting all these things together. And, of course, that's quite possibly, you could say, well, that was maybe a summoning triangle, a thaumaturgic summoning triangle, which is used in ritual. Now, somebody wrote to me and pointed out, well, it could have been to summon something good, which is absolutely true, and it could have had nothing to do with the boy going missing. But I just kind of put it out there because you kind of think, well, you know, maybe that was used in some way, maybe it was just kids playing around, but it was kind of a demonic sort of summoning, possibly. And then you look at the date, and the date was the founding day of the Illuminati, which was on May the 1st, 1776. And the May the 1st is supposed to be, in their kind of beliefs, it's supposed to be the day of human sacrifice, and ideally a child. And they have from the April the 19th to May the 1st. It's a 13-day critical period in which they use it for regeneration. So abductions are encouraged. So again, you could say, well, that's just hokey. But you could say, you know, maybe it's got something to do with it, because there's a lot of researchers that say, well, it is actually. And they point to things like, well, Oklahoma, Waco, Virginia Tech, they all occurred on those days in that 13-day period. But then I think, well, yeah, but so many other things happen on other days as well. So,
right.
You know, happens every day, doesn't it? But again, you know, the Boston bombing, there's supposed to be a ley line that runs through that. Well, I don't know. But I found, and I forget where I found it, because it's not my idea. Oh, it was a blog, actually, called End's Time Elect blog, which now the person who runs it says they claim to be a fourth-generation Illuminati who escaped. Well, maybe not. But they were saying, well, the baby Lisa Irwin that was disappeared in Missouri in 2011, they said, well, if you look at her birthday, her first birthday was going to be 11/11/11. So she was abducted, in their opinion, and taken for this sacrifice, for this day of power. And they say, well, she was taken by the Luciferian Knights of Malta because they actually trace underlying ley lines themselves under the water. They trace them under the water as well. So this person was saying, well, she was smuggled out of the country on a boat using the ley line route by these Luciferian Knights of Malta. The only thing that I found a little bit too unbelievable was that they then went on to say that the door to the house was opened by DARPA technology, and I thought, well, we probably could have just opened the door. So, you know, and also there was a cadaver dogs went in, and there was a trace, they picked up a trace scent of death. Well, again, you know, I don't know. So all of these things, they can go way, way beyond what you think credible, but then also you think, well, why are so many people researching this? You know, it's not just one person. Whenever I find these things, it's not because I've just found one thing. I've found maybe 5 or 6 or 7 corroborations from other people in terms of the research. You know, so I think, okay, maybe there's something in it. What I found fascinating about the Malta story, though, was the idea about the underground caves in Malta.
Yes.
And that's what led me into it. And I thought, oh my God, this is great, because in 1902, some labourers were digging a well, and they accidentally dug a bit too far, and they discovered all these excavations, which led them down into these previously undiscovered catacombs, which go down for multi-levels. And a archaeologist called Graham Stewart made the claim that mythological creatures exist down there, so they're actually real, and the governments have known for so long. And he said they're fed human beings. When they opened the caves, they found 7,000 skeletons. And there's a story about a lady who worked at the British Embassy called Louis Jessup, and she'd gone there on a visit with a guide, and she'd gone around the caves, but she saw a little entrance, and against the advice of the guide, she decided to climb into it with a candle lit. So she went through the little chamber, and it brought her out to this really huge cave that seemed to be bottomless. And opposite her, there was another ledge, and she said that she saw these huge figures that looked to her about 20 feet tall, and they were in a long cloak, and they had long white hair, and they all raised their hands and they beckoned her, and she froze in terror, and then she just quickly ran back out. And she said, when I saw the guide, he gave me such a knowing look, as if he knew what I'd seen, and he'd already seen that. And she wrote a letter to a journal called the Borderland of Science Research, and the editor there, Crab Riley, thought, well, this is a bit of a tall tale. And she also added in her letter that a group of school children and a teacher had gone missing inside the cave before she'd gone there. And he thought, well, I don't know, let's see if we can find anything about this disappearance of the group. And he looked, and he finally found a piece in the National Geographic, and it said that they'd disappeared, that they'd been searched for weeks, and eventually they just gave up. And the idea was that the cave had somehow collapsed on them, and she remembered that when she'd been in there, she'd felt this terrific wind blowing towards her when they'd beckoned her, and she thought, well, that wasn't an accident, that the cave kind of came in on them, you know, it was done on purpose by these entities. But anyway, so he saw the article about them all missing, and it was another archaeologist who'd written this article about the group missing, the children, and he'd said, well, actually, we found 30,000 skeletons down there, and it's a restaurant, and he said it's from all the Atlantean descendants who still live down there. So, I mean, you know, it's quite a crazy story, really.
Yeah.
But I was thinking about some disappearances that had happened in El Malpe National Park, which is the Badlands area, the Badlands National Monument. And they've got these lava tubes that go for quite a few miles, but there's a monument there, and a father and daughter, James Chapman and his daughter, had gone there. It was his birthday, and they were just going to go for a 1 mile walk up to the monument, so they didn't take any hiking boots or rucksacks or anything, it was just going to be a walk. And they didn't come back to their car, so they started a search for them almost immediately. And there were 200 people looking for them. They covered 35 miles in a radius looking for them, and they even sent people down into the caves, and they had helicopters going over, but they couldn't find them at all. And then 8 years later, they found them 4 miles away across the lava flow. But the park spokesman said, well, that it would take them an hour to walk 1 mile, so it would have been a 4 mile journey, a 4 hour journey over really rugged terrain. And they couldn't work out why they'd have gone 4 miles and why they'd have walked for 4 hours when they didn't have any equipment. But, I mean, nobody could work out where had they been for 8 years. You know, the skeletons were found, but where had they been? So,
yeah,
you know, I was going back to the Journal of Borderland Research and the editor there, and he had been writing about these underground races, and he had really come to the conclusion in his mind that actually the reason that we don't see all these underground beings is that, well, they're underground, but also when they come up, they shift in density and vibration, so they can alternate between the third and fourth, you know, because he'd read all these Rosicrucian books and come up with this idea that these things can be invisible. And actually, well, that ties in with a lot of the accounts that I've covered in Something in the Woods and now in this book about all these strange invisible things. So you can't see them, but you have these encounters with things that you hear something or you know. So then I went on to write about all these different accounts of invisible things.
Yeah, starting with the story from someone named Susie.
Well, she wrote in to me again, actually, after one of the shows, and she said, I've written to other people, I've written to paranormal shows, and I've written to websites, and nobody can tell me what happened. She goes, so I'd like to write it to you and just see what you think, and, you know. So she was in New Hampshire, in Hampstead, in 2003, and it was springtime, and she was staying at her sister's, and it was a wooded subdivision. And she used to go out onto the deck each night to smoke a cigarette. And one night, well, the first night she was out there, she kept hearing sticks breaking. And she got a torch and she shone it, but she couldn't see anything out there. But it carried on, and it kind of spooked her. So the next morning, she got her nephew, who was about 11 years old, to go out into the forest bit and try snapping the branches. But he couldn't do it, so she could do it because she was a lot bigger. So she thought, well, they've got to be quite big, these things, because they couldn't break, you know, they broke the sticks. But it happened, it kept happening night after night, and she couldn't see anything there. But she was brought up by scout leaders, so she camped all her life. So she said, I know the sound of animals when they're in the forest, and they make rustling sounds. And we don't really have Bigfoot here, but she goes, there was never any rustling or any other noise. It was just these sticks. But she could never see any branches either. And then she was thinking, well, is it something that they make this noise? Well, anyway, it carried on. And then one night she was out there, and there were plant plots going up the steps onto the deck. And she said they suddenly started moving, so they both separated. And it was like something was walking up the deck, but I couldn't see anything there. But there was no wind, there was no noise, there was no footsteps. It was nothing there, but it was moving the plants. And she was convinced, you know, there was something there. And she had a few encounters indoors as well, where she was seeing dark shadows, and lights were coming on, and the dogs were going crazy. And she was adamant, you know. She said, everybody tried to convince me it's animals, it's this, it's that, it's the trees popping. She said, but I know the sound of the forest, I know them well, and it's not that, but I don't understand what these were doing. And she said they were coming from both sides of the house at the same time, so it was more than one of them, and almost like they were synchronizing. And so her sort of question was, well, what were they doing? They seem to be up in the trees. Are they hunting? Are they watching? What's their intention? And, you know, she firmly believes that's what it is. And I found another account, actually, of a man who was in his backyard, in his garden, and he kept hearing and seeing branches being thrown from his tree about 60 feet away. And his friend came over and he said, look, I don't understand what's going on. There's no other sounds. All the birds have gone quiet, nothing else happening, but these branches keep coming down. So he walked about 30 feet up to the tree, and this massive branch flew down, but there was nothing up there that he could see. And funnily enough, and then in his account, he said, well, I just prayed because I was so scared. And he said, and then it stopped, and it never continued. So, you know, really strange accounts.
Yeah, well, I've actually had that happen to me as well, where I have had all the sounds stop and heard something moving up in the trees that sounded very large, snapping branches, but you couldn't see anything.
Really? My goodness. Well, there's lots of accounts of these, you know. There's one that I found that I put in the previous book, and it's there's a group of 4 women in woods in Italy, and this is in the 1700s, and it actually got written into the French Annals of Science. The Academy of Science put it into their journal, and they were walking in the woods, and then one of them suddenly fell to the floor dead, and her internal organs had been pulled out of her body, her clothes were ripped, her skull was exposed, she was dead. And, you know, your first sort of instinct is, well, maybe the women attacked her, but on the other hand, you know, a doctor had actually said, no, that's not the case, and we don't understand what happened here. But there was no flesh and no blood around the scene either, so it was really weird. And there's a famous explorer called James Allen Rene, and he was in the wilderness in northern Canada, and he was with a guide, and he was crossing a frozen lake, and he wrote it in his journal, and he said that he could see footsteps in the water over the surface of the lake, and something was making these splashing footsteps, and it was coming faster and faster and closer, but he couldn't see anything, and it actually run into him and hit him, but he couldn't see anything. And he wrote, you know, that I have no explanation for what happened that day. There's no reasonable... but the story that I really like is the one in the Cairngorms, which is the Highlands of Scotland. And in the highest peak there's supposed to be an entity called the Grey Man, because a professor called Norman Colley was at the general meeting for the climbers in 1925, and he was on his own descending from the peak one day, and he started hearing these footsteps behind him, but they sounded huge. It was very misty, but he was also too scared to turn around. And at first he thought, well, being rational, it's got to be my own echo. But he thought, but they're so much bigger than mine. And he got terrified, and he actually ended up running down the mountain. But at the meeting, he felt embarrassed, but he thought, I'm going to tell these people what happened. And after the meeting, 2 or 3 people came up to him, and they said, well, we've had that experience ourselves. And even stranger, a couple of people said, we've had this really terrible feeling of doom, and we've had this urge to throw ourselves off the mountain.
Wow.
I know, and a doctor had written to them and said, we were chased off the mountain by this entity. And then there was a woman who is called Wendy Wood, and she's in the National Party in Scotland, so she's a politician, so you think she's quite kind of sensible. And she had written of an account where she was down in the forest area by the mountain, and she'd heard this voice right beside her ear. And to rationalise it, she thought, okay, well, it's somebody that's in trouble in the area, somebody's fallen or something, let me have a look. And she walked around, but again, as she walked around, she heard these really big, heavy footsteps behind her. And she thought, well, the voice was in Gaelic as well, which is a really old language. Nobody really speaks that in Scotland now. So she was adamant. She said that definitely there was something there. I couldn't see it, but I could hear these footsteps, and they weren't mine. And actually, a friend of mine sent me an account that somebody from the BBC, who is a producer for the Outdoors show in Scotland, and he'd written a really weird account himself, and he'd been climbing with a friend in the same area, and he'd been quite near to the top, and he was writing, saying, there are sounds that you like to hear, so the sound when you put your ice pick in, and you know that it's secured and you're going to be safe, or when your rope has made the click with the, I don't know the terms, but so you know that you're safe and that you like those sounds. But then there are sounds,
right.
Then there are sounds that you really don't want to hear. And he said, and we were there, and we heard this. It started as a moan, and it got to an ear-piercing scream, and it curdled your blood. And he said, so we knew somebody had just watched their companion fall to their death. They'd had a climbing accident. We knew that had happened. And he said, and it was so unsettling that we just wanted to get down the mountain, but we couldn't because we were in such a precarious position. It was only safer if we went up and then scaled down. So we had to hold on. But when they got down to the bottom, they saw the mountain rescue people, they saw other climbers, and they said to them, what's happened? And the mountain rescue people weren't actually going out to look for them. They were just at their station. And they said, has somebody had an accident? And they said, don't know, we haven't heard anything about it. And another man who was climbing had heard it, and he'd actually abseiled from his position to go down to where he heard the sound, but there was nobody there. And this BBC producer, he searched for the whole day. They phoned the police, they spoke to every person there, but nobody had seen anything or nothing had happened. So it's like, where did that voice come from?
Right.
And there was another account I found from a woman called Anna Evans, and she was on holiday in Donegal in Ireland, in a really mountainous, remote area, and there was only one house near them, but it was a 20-minute walk, and it was also abandoned. Well, she was with her family, and she was standing on the doorstep just enjoying the sunshine, and she started hearing this group of voices calling her name. And she stood there and listened to it for a moment because she thought, well, am I imagining this? And then eventually she got her mum and she said, can you hear that? And she said, yeah, they're calling your name. And all of they could hear it. Her father could hear it, and he was a doctor and a scientist. He could hear it. The brother, who was younger, he got into bed and put the pillow over his head because he was so scared. They looked everywhere. They looked up the chimney. There was no wind to have carried the voices, and they couldn't work out where it had come from. But it was these group of people were calling her name, and it's like they were trying to lure her away somewhere. But there was nobody there.
Yeah, that is such a creepy story.
Yeah, I know. And how do these things happen? There's no explanation for them.
And you have a few like that in this book, too.
Yeah, there's a lot. There's a man who's a hunter, and he blogs about his hunting escapades. And he's called Russ Chastain, and he'd gone out on his first hunting trip with his dad, and they'd set up in separate trees, and he saw the bushes move in front of him, and didn't think much of it, but just thought, I can't see an animal there. But it had suddenly gone all quiet, and he felt really apprehensive. And then, out of the corner of his eye, he could see something moving behind him. And then he heard he describes it as the most primal cry he's ever heard. It was a part animal, part spirit, part ethereal, but completely evil. And he was thinking, well, I've got a gun, but I can't see what I'm supposed to shoot, you know. And then the really weird thing was, and he was thinking, well, do I run? What do I do? And so he just froze. And then he didn't hear it again, and it had gone. But when he got down out of the tree and he went over to his dad, he said, what the heck was that? And his dad said, what are you talking about? He hadn't heard it, you know.
Huh.
So it's just bizarre.
You talk a little bit in the book about things being seen in the infrared, and I've always found that fascinating. Andrew Collins, one of his early books, Alien Energy, he deals with that.
Oh.
The infrared photography and such that picks up what looks like life forms. You actually mentioned some videos that I checked out on here that were definitely very odd, that were done in not just infrared, but what else was the guy doing them in?
I believe it was ultraviolet he'd done it in. The website's called Quest for the Invisible, if I remember correctly.
Yes. Yeah, and that was really interesting. And there's also, I remember an episode of UFO Hunters where they showed a police helicopter down in Florida, and it was shooting an infrared out the back of the helicopter, and you can see a UFO-like structure following them.
Oh, my goodness.
And they're looking, and there's nothing there, and they're freaking out because here it is on the monitor, and they turn, and the thing swings around and follows them again.
Really? Oh, my goodness. Well, I found this guy's website, and he's based in Oxford, in England. And he, as I say, he takes these recordings, but he does put the camera through. It's quite complicated, but he puts it through a process where it's just ultraviolet, I believe. And he's got them, and they look like kind of flying. They're not rods, but they look like kind of long streaks of fibrous, dark matter. And and the weird thing with his pictures are that they're descending down into the ground, and you know they go right down to from the sky downwards. So the reason I was sort of putting it in there was because in the other book I'd found this guy Trevor Constable, who was a Navy veteran, and he spent 20 years studying these things in the 1950s, and he used infrared. And his opinion was, you know, these things are coming down, and they are taking cattle, and they're taking people. That was his opinion. And you can't see them, but as you say, they're invisible. But when you look through the infrared, they look like they're rippling, fibrous, amoeba-type structures. So
yeah,
they're huge, you know. And the idea is that they kind of increase in density and come downwards and swoop down, and that's when they take somebody, or they take, you know, animals or birds, or so they feed off them. But they're rippling, shimmering sorts of things, but you just can't see them with the naked eye, so they're there all the time. But Ivan Sanderson and Carl Schuker, they were very much of that opinion as well. But I thought it was interesting because the Air Force in the 50s as well had said that when they were talking about UFOs, and they said there's a possibility of the existence of some of these strange sort of ET animals, because many of the objects that they were seeing, they said they act more like animals than anything else. But Trevor Constable and another guy, Michael White, who was a New Zealand photographer, and they'd found these objects, and sometimes they look like UFOs in shape as well.
Yeah.
So, you know, and the theory was, well, do they come down and take people? I don't know. But it's quite weird to think that they're there all the time and you can't see them.
Yeah, and it's something you can actually photograph and look at and videotape.
Yeah.
And I don't have a good explanation for what could cause that from a camera standpoint.
No, because Trevor Constable gave into Pathé, the people that used to make all the Hollywood films, and they rigorously tested all of these photos, you know, and they couldn't come up with an explanation either.
And I know one of the explanations people put out for the photographs was like, well, they're emulsion blurs or something like that, and it's been like the work Andrew Collins did, he went through to show that that's not the case.
Oh.
And as well as people would use cameras like a normal camera and an infrared camera next to each other so you could see there was nothing actually there visibly when the picture was taken.
Right.
So, I mean, it's something that seems like it should be easy to investigate further.
Well, it should be, yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so let's get into something kind of dark here, and not that some of this hasn't already been dark, but you cover a rash of hangings from teenagers.
Yeah,
that's going on.
Yeah, it is really dark, and yeah, it's not nice at all. There's a place called Bridgend in Wales, and a teenager was found in the woods in 2008, a teenage girl, and she was hanging from a tree in the Snake Pit woods. And the parents and the friends couldn't understand why she would go and do that. And it was in the newspapers, and a man walking his dog had found her, and he said, what the heck is going on here? And the reason he was saying that was because her cousin had killed himself, his friend, an 18-year-old, had killed himself in the same way. There was a spate, it seemed, because actually by the time she did it, there'd been, by 2012, there'd been 79, all hanging themselves in the woods, so all using the same method. Now, there was a range of theories, because obviously it was in the newspapers when it first came out, and a couple of people had tried it and weren't successful, and they'd said, well, we're hearing voices in our head. Others had tried it and they couldn't remember that they'd even tried it. And so the newspapers started covering it, and the theory at first was this is an emotional contagion. So it's a small rural place. You're hearing about it, and it's influencing you. Because that's what you're seeing, that's what you're reading. And then there was the theory that it was being spread by the internet, social media, and that has been a case in school children, sadly, where people bully each other, But the police found no evidence of that at all. They'd looked and they couldn't find any evidence. So then the local council and the politicians were saying, look, you've got to stop covering this in the newspapers, because by you covering it, you're normalising it, but you're also sensationalising it. So this is what you're doing this, you're causing it. But the thing was, nobody could really understand why. It was the same age group, same method, and a professor from a university in Sweden, Amsterdam, I believe, Dr. Johansson, he was a specialist in teen suicide. And he said this is a really highly unusual cluster. We've never really had this before. And it's not a method that women would generally use. They would choose a different method. Now, if you look at the area itself, well, it's a rural degeneration there. So, with the manufacturing base gone years ago, there's fewer jobs there. It's a place of high unemployment, poverty. So you could say, well, it's a depressive kind of place to be, and that's why. But it didn't really explain why there was such a big cluster there and why they were using the same method. They also were never leaving suicide notes. So that kind of was a bit odd as well. And then theories were coming up, people were talking about it, there's theories on the internet, and the coroner was also saying that some of them were taking antidepressants. I think 7 of them were. So that was said to be possibly a factor. There was no drugs apart from minuscule amounts of maybe cannabis, so it wasn't that they were all high on drugs.
Right.
But an independent psychiatrist called David Healy, he said it's the antidepressants causing it. But then I thought, well, okay, but only 7 were taking it, and also everybody in the world's taking antidepressants at some point. There's a high amount of people taking them. So why isn't it happening everywhere? And then there was, it seemed to be dying out in the newspapers. So the idea was, well, maybe there's some kind of media ban, like they say, so we're not really hearing about it. Because David Healy was saying, well, actually, it's still carrying on. It's going on now. But the coroner does not have to say that it's suicide. They can say it's unknown. They can say it's an open verdict. If there's no suicide note, they don't necessarily have to say. They can say it was misadventure. So perhaps it's not being recorded. So, the conspiracy kind of thing was growing, saying it's going on, it's not being recorded. And there was a journalist, investigative journalist called David Goff, and he really looks into sort of, all these black things, and he said, this place is just wrapped in secrets. It's still happening. The figures are very, very much higher. So I was thinking, well, why would this be happening, in this area? Is it something to do with the area itself? Because there was one case where a girl had come to stay with her boyfriend who lived there, and she hung herself. And you think, well, that's really strange.
Yeah.
And a couple of the survivors, one of them spoke to Vanity Fair magazine, and she said, my head kept telling me to do it. Everything would be okay if I just did it. And there was another boy, and he'd tried it indoors, and it failed. And then his mum took him to the hospital, and the mental health nurse there said, he's fine, there's nothing wrong with him. But he was saying, but I'm hearing these voices. So you think, okay, well, it's mental illness, But then do all of these people suddenly become diagnosed with mental illness? Because that would be a cluster in itself, and that would be quite unusual. Yeah. So you think, well, what the heck's going on here? And you think, well, he was saying also, I've got voices, and the other girl that tried, I've got voices, and the others weren't able to tell us. But, so I think, okay, well, what are these voices? Where are they coming from? Well, are they demonic? Well, it would take a very powerful kind of demon to affect them all, but maybe. And then, the idea was maybe they were suddenly triggered. They suddenly snapped, because one boy, he was absolutely fine. He was a happy-go-lucky chap. And he walked home after spending the evening with his friends, and something happened. It was almost like something happened on the way home that made him do it, So you think, well, what's triggering these people? And then it really gets into conspiracy, because a couple of newspapers had featured a man called Dr. Roger Coghill, and he'd said, well, they're all living far closer than normal to the telecom masts for the, the Wi-Fi. And they've got more powerful, obviously, because now we want more data, we want more downloads. And he was saying, well, it's these masts. They're far closer than they should be in this area. And yet, yes, well, maybe, but they're also closer to a lot of, particularly, not suburban, but built-up capitals and cities. So you think, well, I don't know about that. And there was an award-winning science writer. He said, no, you're absolutely wrong. It's not these masts at all. And a few people were saying, well, what about the new Tetra police mast? And they have these masts now because they've got a new two-way communication for the police radio and for government agencies. So these are microwave pulsed frequencies, and the theory built up there because an expert in physics, Dr. Hyland, he's saying, well, with the low frequency pulsing, it can influence your mood and behaviour. And you can go from depression to rage. It just depends on the frequency modulation used. And you can also intracranially induce sounds and words into somebody. So you can put words in somebody's head. And then you think, well, why? Why would somebody even do that? But it gets very dark, and it's, that's the theory there. And I did think about, well, they used to use something called a mosquito device, which is far, far less harmful. But it is an antisocial deterrent, and it's a sonic deterrent. So they put it into a town in another part of the country, in Wiltshire, because they wanted to see if it could stop the antisocial behaviour, vandalism and thefts and things of teens. And that particular device only affects you if you're between teenage to 25 years old, so nobody else can hear it. But I checked the council records in Bridgend, and they had actually discussed using it for a new housing estate, but they said, no, it's against people's human rights and we're not going to use it. And it wasn't going to be used in that area where the suicides were happening, so I thought, well, I don't know about that. But then you look at people who have researched all of this, and there's somebody called Barry Trower, and he's allegedly an MI5 former physicist, and he was saying about the way that the scalar waves and microwaves can be used. And he was saying, well, I'm from an intel background, and I can tell you that they've used it to influence people's minds and change your thought pattern. You can remotely change somebody's opinion in their head and put another thought in there. And a guy called Tim Riffat, he was talking about Dr. Ross A.D. of the Project Pandora in America that had been done, where the Tetra, the police communication system, is actually being used on exactly the same frequency as the ELF experiments they did then, and that was causing frenzied emotional imbalance, apparently. So you can go very, very, very far down that field, and you can blame it all on that, but you can also say, well, that's ridiculous. Why would they do it there? And what's the point of it, But that's where one set of theories were going, and then it gets even more outlandish because there's quite a few people that in England, not a few, but a handful, who say they were super soldiers. And you mentioned it earlier about being kept in a base, and you've got mind control experiments being done on you, and there's one guy who's called James Casbolt, and he was saying that he said, I can tell you what's going on. He was putting this all over forums, saying that this is the Black Ops people are out in this area. They're searching for an escaped chimera, okay, who's escaped from the underground base, and this is a reptilian hybrid. Can look like a man, can approach you, it can telepathically influence you, it can put thoughts in your head, it hypnotizes you, it then goes off, it remote views you, and it tells you to kill yourself. The reason it does it is because it wants all of that negative energy, because it feeds off it. It goes even more wildly into speculation there. But on the other hand, there are people that say this is happening, this is true. So I'm not saying it's true, but, and then I thought, okay, but there's also, there's a castle nearby, okay, and it's called Candleston Castle. It's now a ruin. It was built in the 14th century, and it's on the moors just there. And it features in books written by Kenneth Grant, fiction books, but he was actually an occult writer, and he was a ceremonial magician, and he was also secretary to Aleister Crowley, and he founded the Thelemite organisation, and after Crowley's death, he became head of the OTO. And some people say that in the ruin itself, there's evidence of rituals there. Well, Kenneth Grant never wrote that he'd actually manifested anything there, but he did write, in one of his books, he writes about manifesting Pan, the elemental god of the woods, and he said that he did that with Crowley. He writes about it in his journal and says how they'd manifested this being. Well, I'm not saying that they did it, but, it did. It's speculation again. It's wildly speculative. But, people seem to have been drawn to that ruin to carry out some kind of ritual. So, well, maybe they evoked something demonic. Maybe they summoned something up. Maybe they took the text too literally about, summoning entities to commit sacrifices. Maybe they went way over the top. If that's possible, at all, I don't know. But there was there's an English heretic blog, and it's calling the place an occult pestilence. So it's like a place where there's an outburst of plague going on. But I mean, again, it's all wildly speculative. And I found a place called Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota where a similar thing seems to be going on. And there was a spate of teen suicides. I think there was about 9, and over 100 are trying it. And in that case, it was being encouraged by the social media. They were encouraging each other. But they were also supposed to be encouraged by this spirit that they believe in, that's a suicide spirit, and they call it Walking Sam, which is a really tall, black figure. And some of the elders were saying that the children were saying that they'd seen this figure, this entity was appearing to them, and it was telling them to kill themselves. So, yes, again, you can really go around in circles with these, because you could say any of it could be causing it. You could just say it's a mundane reason. You could say it's absolutely due to poverty in a poor area.
Yeah, I don't know. The fact that they keep coming up with the I'm hearing voices in my head suggests to me something unusual is happening there. Maybe not paranormal, but maybe testing some technology. Why you would test it on teenagers, though, I don't know.
No.
Maybe they're more susceptible to it. Just
don't know. Do not know. It's strange. Yeah.
It's a really disturbing thing, regardless of what the cause is.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the last one I guess we have time for here is the case of the 2 Swedish twins. And people can actually watch this on YouTube, correct?
I believe one of them is called Madness on the Motorway, something like that. It's if you Google Sabrina Eriksson or Madness on the Motorway or BBC documentary, you'll find it. There's lots of videos on it, which is good because you can actually see it. It's a really strange story. It was back in 2008, and it was on the M6 motorway, which is up in Stoke-on-Trent, which is a rural part of northern England. And the BBC were filming a documentary of patrol officers on the motorways. So they were in the dispatch centre, and they were just watching the CCTV cameras, and on one of the cameras they see 2 women walking along the central reservation, the barrier in the middle between the two opposite roads, which is obviously very dangerous and it's illegal, you can't do it. So they dispatched a patrol car to go and ask the women to come off of that reservation area, and when they got there, as the car was going towards them, the BBC are watching from the control room, and both of the women run into the path of the oncoming traffic. And one of them is hit, and they carry on, and they go to the side of the highway. So they, now in the control room, dispatch the police. So the police get there really, really quickly, and they're expecting to see probably 2 fatalities. But the women are still standing up, and there's nothing wrong with them, but one of them was hit by a fast-moving car. So the police get out of the cars, and they go up towards them, and it's on camera. The BBC are filming it. As the police come towards them, they get really, really anxious and disturbed, and one of them runs into the oncoming traffic again and is hit by a car, and the other one is running into the road and is hit by a lorry, a truck, going about 60 miles an hour, and she goes under the wheels. So now, the one that was hit by the car is unconscious in the road, and the one hit by the lorry, you can see that there's bones broken in her body, in her legs, sorry. But she becomes really aggressive and violent, and she's saying, I know that you're not real, and you're not real people. But the police are saying, now they've made this documentary looking back on it, and they're saying, well, how did these 2 women survive it? They can't understand it, because the woman that was unconscious has now regained consciousness, and she's got up, and she's knocked one of the policemen over, punched them, and then she starts running again, and she tries to run into the traffic again. And the police are saying, but their strength was phenomenal, because it took 6 police and some drivers to restrain one of them, the one that's just run into the traffic again. And they're saying, why would they do that? What are they trying to do? Are they trying to kill themselves? Why are they trying to fight us? And the girls have said to each other, you can't protect us, and they're saying, you want our body parts, which is all really strange. So
yeah.
They take the girl who's got the broken legs, they take to the hospital, and the other one they take to the police station. And what they can't understand is that this one they take to the police station, she's really calm and she's really happy and she's chatting and she's completely changed. But she's got no injuries, but she was knocked over by a car and unconscious. So she's flirting with the policeman at the police station, and they think this is ridiculous. And they check her medical records. Now, they turn out to be Swedish twins. Initially, they were on a coach, and they got off the coach at a rest stop nearby, and the coach driver thought, oh, they're acting a bit suspiciously, they're clutching their bags, what are they doing? So he told the manager of the service station, who then got the police, searched the bags, and there was nothing there, so they let them go, but they wouldn't let them back on the coach. So that's why they ended up walking down the motorway. But at the police station, they check the medical records, and they drug test the girl, but she's not on any medication. She's not on PCP or bar salts or anything like that. She's not on steroids. So what they do is they keep her, they charge her with assault, and then they let her go the next morning. And her other sister is in hospital, and she goes to the nearest small town, and it gets to evening time, and she sees 2 men walking along with a dog, and she approaches them. And she says, I'm looking for a bed and breakfast, a hotel to stay in for the night. And one of them says, well, it's too small a place, you won't find one here. He said, but if you come back to my house, I'll make you something to eat, and we'll phone around and see what we can find. And he was really being a good Samaritan. So he was with his friend, and they go back to his house, and during the evening she becomes really paranoid, and she offers them cigarettes, but as they go to smoke them, she goes, no, they're poisoned, they could be poisoned, and she's looking out of the window thinking, is somebody coming? Anyway, his friend goes home, and the man whose house it is says, well, you can stay here for the night, it's fine, you won't find a hotel. So we don't know what happens that night, but then the next morning he's opened the front door, and his neighbour sees him, and he's been stabbed, and he dies. And before he dies, he says, she stabbed me. And she makes a quick exit, and she's walking along the high street, and a soldier sees her. He's driving along in his car, and he sees this woman, and she's hitting herself on the head with a hammer. So he gets out of the car, and he tries to stop her, but she hits him. She's got a piece of a brick in her pocket for some reason, and she hits him over the head with it and runs off. And she runs, and by now the police have caught up with her. Somebody's called the police, and she runs away. She goes through the woods, and she gets to a bridge, and she just jumps off it. And she breaks an ankle, and she fractures her skull. So she ends up being taken to prison. She's given a prison sentence. She serves about 400 days while waiting for the trial, and then she's put into prison for a sentence, but actually she's released after about a year. So really, it's a very, very short sentence. So of course, because it was such a big case, there's a lot of kind of speculation about what on earth was going on, because they couldn't understand why she herself was not injured. They seemed to be hearing some kind of voices, or something was going on in their heads, and you could say, well, she was hearing some kind of voice, because why was she trying to hit herself on the head with a hammer? Was she trying to stop the voices, or was she... At the trial, they were deemed to both be mentally ill, but they weren't mentally ill before it happened, and the judges said it came on really suddenly, and it was some kind of name that we've never really heard of in terms of diagnosis. It came on really suddenly, but it's resolved itself and it's gone. Well, how do they know it wasn't going to come back? But so they decided it and just disappeared. So all these kind of theories started building up about what was going on, and I suppose when my first chapter was written from the man that wrote into me saying about the fact that he knew of one of his jobs was to help rehabilitate super soldiers, which he claimed existed. And, you know, it's been a theme that kind of crops up throughout the books. So people were saying, well, these two seem to be kind of on some kind of triggered thing. You know, why were they saying about body parts? They seem to be wanting to destruct themselves. And there's a man called Miles Johnston who does a lot of work in the UK and Ireland on YouTube, and he interviews, you know, very out there people who come up with theories. But he's done a lot of research interviewing people about bases that supposedly might exist under, you know, possibly military bases, you know, and if you go down underneath, there's alien hybrids that have been regenerated and programmed, and they work on you, and, you know, there's all these mind control experiments. So the theory was coming out that these two had escaped. They were being, you know, they were triggered to terminate because they were of no use anymore or something.
Right.
You know, and because they were saying you want our organs, they were saying, well, you know, they've been kept and they've been held in these bases, they've escaped, or alternatively, they've been sent out to do this as some kind of like revelation of their existence to show people we've got them, they exist, and they can do what we want them to do. Some people were saying actually it was a false flag because they weren't even hit. I don't know, because I think that it looks like they were hit, but you know, so they were saying it was a planned event. It was just to say we've got these people. And you can also counter the whole thing by saying, well, actually they weren't super soldiers anyway, because one of them ended up in hospital for several months. So if they're super soldiers, why were their bones broken? So that kind of defeats the whole purpose. But a man wrote a book about it, and he came up with an even wilder theory. He was saying, well, you know, this girl, she was mentally ill. She went into the house. These other people, they took advantage of the fact that she was mentally ill, and they used that to blame a murder on her. They were drug dealers. They went in there. They killed her. But the girls were also drug dealers. But when I looked more into his background, I found that he used to post all over the internet saying super soldiers exist, and revealing, you know, being a whistleblower about super soldiers. And then this story came out, and he was saying, well, actually, I know that I used to write under all these different pseudonyms saying about super soldiers, but I've looked into this case. They don't exist. They never have done. No, they were just used because they were mentally ill and they're drug mules, and, you know, so he was actually distancing himself. I'm thinking, what's going on? So he was distancing himself completely. So then you think, okay, well, if you want to believe in the conspiracy, you can say he was being leaned on to say they don't exist. But, you know, you can go around in circles, and you can also go off in the wildest speculation. But, you know, these are not my ideas. I'm not just plucking them out of thin air. These are some of the theories that come out. And, you know, I can spend a week researching a theory, and I could probably spend a year going down that route, but I stop. But, you know, I'm not sort of plucking them out and just making them up. It's all really, really, you know, I spend months researching these things. So some of these things are absolutely crazy, and some of them may not be. It's the reader, the listener decides, you know?
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, that's what I enjoy so much about the book, is you're not afraid to throw some really out there theories out there. You're not promoting them necessarily. You're just saying, here they are.
Yeah. I mean, they're fascinating, all of them. You know, whether you want to believe it or not, there's a lot of people that do. It's like when David Chalmers writes about the ley lines, he's saying it's not necessarily about whether you believe them. You have to think about the fact that some people do believe them, and if they're in, you know, in power positions, well, they believe in them. You don't believe in them, but they do. So what's that implication? You know.
True.
Yeah.
True. And I mean, you have a lot of stuff in this book, and it's all pretty much unexplained. It
is. Yes. I mean, that's why I love it, because it's so mysterious.
And what's the title of this one again?
On Amazon, it's called Taken in the Woods. It's got the subtitle Chronicle of Stolen Souls, Body Collectors, but the first bit is Taken in the Woods.
Okay, all right. And what are you working on now?
I'm working on a follow-up, because the thing is that I leave out so much research, because otherwise the book would be, thousands of pages. So I've always got bits that I find links, I find bits that match up with something else, and then I find new bits. So I'm working on a follow-up, because there's so much more that I've really left out that needs researching. It just goes on, because you don't find a definitive answer that leads you searching even more.
Yeah. So when do you think the next book will be out?
I'm hoping within the next 2 months.
Okay. You have a name for it yet?
No, it's probably going to be very similar to the other ones. Cause Panic in the Woods, something like that. But it will be very, it's all on this kind of same theme, but I love to find new stuff to add or to back up things that I found before or to take it in a different angle. So, yeah, there's so much. It's a fascinating topic.
There's a lot of stuff in here I had never heard of, and that's not something I say very often.
Oh.
Because I'm so familiar with this stuff that
right.
I'm usually, picking up a little bit here and a little bit there, but I read through this and was like, I'm not familiar with most of this.
Oh, it's so exciting to find new stuff as well,
Exactly.
Yeah, we do know of things that happen and it sort of carries on, and you get to know more about it, but it's so exciting when you find something that's you didn't know was out there.
And I find, as I told you before we started the interview, that a number of these things have happened to me as well. And
yeah.
I'm looking and going, well, I wonder when I'm going to be taken.
You won't be. But
I don't know. My reactions to it are very different, I think, than most people's, because I turn and just kind of face it,
right.
rather than getting that fear reaction. Even if I have the fear reaction, my instinct is to stop and just kind of deal with the fear.
Well, that's very brave to be able to do that, actually. It's very brave, so it's good that you can.
I think it's a key to dealing with some of this stuff is to learn how to overcome fear.
Yeah. I heard you saying that, actually, on your podcast when you were doing your show, and you were saying that about confronting it. Yeah.
Yeah, when I did the one on Kundalini,
yes. Yeah.
Because it seems like that, how you feel about it and how you react to it seems to change certain phenomena. Yeah,
because we were saying, weren't we, in some of these accounts, I find it really amazing that sometimes if people say a prayer, now I know it depends on your belief system, but obviously if a person says a prayer and they have that belief, it can stop the encounter.
Right.
And you were saying, well, it very much depends on the power of your belief, really. If you believe it will work, it's more about your belief as opposed to anything else, in a way.
Well, because you have accounts, too, where someone will say a prayer or, do whatever, and it doesn't work.
Yeah.
So why would it work sometimes and not other times unless it's linked to the person, not the actual words? That power of belief is very strong.
Yeah.
So... All right, well, I thank you so much for spending some time with us again, and we'll have you back on when your next book comes out.
Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you, Sawyer.
You do collect stories from people.
Yeah, I do.
Where can people find you?
Facebook is Steph Young Author, or email is stephenyoungauthor@hotmail.com, I believe. Probably Facebook is easier, Stephen Young Author. But I do like to hear accounts. I really do. It's fascinating.
Okay, and people can pick up your books. They're all on Amazon.
Yes.
And they're all very, very low priced.
Yeah. Well, I don't think they need to be that expensive. I'd like it to be accessible, for people to read. So I'm not going to put it really expensive. It's nice if you can, just pick up a book that's not going to cost you loads of money.
All right. Awesome. Again, thank you, Steph.
Thank you so much.